The Geneva International Convention Center buzzed with the charged energy of global power. Gathered under one roof, delegates from 150 nations moved through marble corridors, their polished shoes echoing against walls that had carried decades of diplomatic history. Outside, the Swiss autumn rain tapped steadily against towering windows, while inside the hum of air conditioning blended with quiet anticipation. Camera crews adjusted their equipment with practiced precision, their lenses catching brief glimpses of leaders locked in hushed conversations, the sharp scent of coffee mixed with expensive cologne, as translators tested their headsets one last time. This was the stage where reputations were made or shattered with a single misplaced word. In the African Union section, Ibrahim Traoré sat in military fatigues, his presence a striking contrast to the sea of tailored suits surrounding him. His calloused hands rested firmly on the polished desk, but his eyes scanned the chamber like a commander surveying a battlefield. At just 35, the Burkinabe leader was the youngest head of state in the room, yet his calm intensity commanded the attention of diplomats twice his age. Behind him, his small team of advisors whispered urgently in Moor and French, their voices almost drowned out by the growing murmur of the chamber. Traoré had traveled more than 4,000 miles to speak on one issue: Western interference in African affairs. For him, this moment was either an opening to elevate his voice on the world stage or a silence that would follow him forever. Just 3 rows ahead, Judge Edward Chen adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and carefully reviewed his notes. The American-born jurist had built his reputation on sharp legal reasoning and an unwavering commitment to international law. His black robe seemed ceremonial in this political theater, but everyone in the room knew his words carried real weight. Chen's parents had fled persecution in Taiwan, and he understood better than most the fine line between sovereignty and accountability. Today, he had specifically requested the opportunity to respond to any challenges about judicial independence. His pen moved steadily across a yellow legal pad, shaping phrases that could alter the course of diplomatic dialogue. The session moderator tapped his gavel twice. The metallic ring cut through the air, freezing conversations mid-sentence. Delegates settled into their leather chairs, the shuffle of papers creating a nervous rhythm across the chamber. Television cameras swiveled toward the podium where a placard announced in 4 languages, "Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso." The young leader rose deliberately, his boots clicking against the polished floor as he approached the microphone that would carry his words to millions. Behind the glass partition, international journalists leaned forward, sensing that history was moments away. Edward Chen, too, felt the weight of the moment. His journey to the stage had begun in a cramped Oakland apartment where his immigrant parents had worked endless shifts to pay for his education. His father, once a judge in Taiwan, had fled political persecution with little more than a suitcase of legal texts and unshakable principles. Young Edward translated court documents at the kitchen table while his mother cooked, absorbing the language of justice before most children his age could grasp its meaning. By 12, he could recite constitutional amendments in English and Mandarin. His brilliance carried him to Harvard Law, where he stood out not just for intellect but for moral conviction. While classmates chased prestige, Chen spent nights defending immigrants at a legal aid clinic, people whose struggles reminded him of his own families. He graduated summa cum laude, his thesis on sovereignty and international law earning him offers from top firms. He turned them down, choosing public service instead. His first major case challenging a federal deportation policy earned him victory and recognition as a defender of the vulnerable. At 32, he became one of the youngest federal judges in the country, his confirmation marked by rare bipartisan support in the courtroom. Chen's precision and discipline were unmatched. His rulings were thorough, his reasoning meticulous, and his fairness unquestioned. He dismantled arguments from corporate giants and government agencies alike, winning respect across the political spectrum. His reputation eventually drew global attention, leading to his appointment as a judicial advisor to the UN Human Rights Council. Now, in Geneva, that reputation was about to be tested. The chamber's eyes shifted between the African military captain, and the American judge. The world knew that today's words would carry consequences far beyond the marble walls of the convention center. The confrontation was inevitable. Judge Edward Chen's judicial opinions had been cited in Supreme Court decisions and studied in law schools across 3 continents, each one regarded as a masterclass in constitutional reasoning. Younger judges sought his mentorship, not only for career guidance but for the moral compass that came with it. In corporate boardrooms, lawyers whispered his name with dread because in his courtroom, expensive suits and political connections held no power against constitutional principles and human rights law. His reputation had not been granted overnight. It had been forged case by case, ruling by ruling, across 2 decades of refusing to bend before powerful interests. Now, that reputation stood to be tested against a young African revolutionary across a diplomatic chamber. For Ibrahim Traoré, the weight of 21 million Burkinabe voices pressed heavily on his shoulders as he prepared to address the international community. His nation had lived through decades of colonial extraction, its gold funneling into European banks while children still walked miles for clean water. The coup that had brought him to power was more than politics. It was the voice of a generation demanding dignity, a break from the cycle of foreign puppets ruling African soil. In his jacket pocket, Traoré carried folded letters from farmers whose lands had been sold to foreign corporations without consent. Their words, handwritten in ink and desperation, were his reminder of who he truly spoke for. His military uniform bore no medals, no vanity, only the insignia of a man who had chosen duty over privilege. This speech, he knew, could either legitimize his leadership on the global stage or see him dismissed by Western media as just another strong man. The numbers told a story the world didn't want to hear. Burkina Faso produced enough cotton to clothe half of Europe, yet most of its people could not afford a shirt made from their own harvest. French corporations pulled $2 billion worth of gold from Burkinabe soil each year, while paying less than $50 million in taxes to the national treasury. Traoré had studied those contracts late into sleepless nights, his anger hardening into cold resolve. Every line of his prepared remarks was crafted to destroy the illusion that African poverty was natural, rather than carefully engineered. The backlash had already begun. Western capitals bristled the moment his government pushed for fairer terms in resource extraction. The French ambassador had warned of consequences if Burkina Faso continued on its path of economic independence. Development projects long approved by the World Bank suddenly faced irregularities. American military aid was suspended, leaving his borders more vulnerable to terrorist threats. European newspapers, silent for years, now filled their pages with warnings about human rights abuses and democratic backsliding. Traoré understood the pattern too well. When African leaders challenged the status quo, the response was swift. But today, standing in Geneva, he felt the burden of something larger than himself. He was not just the voice of Burkina Faso. He carried the weight of an entire continent that was tired of lectures on governance from the very powers that had designed its poverty. His advisors had urged caution, diplomacy, and softened words that would avoid sanctions. Yet the farmer's letters in his pocket reminded him why compromise had failed Africa for 60 years. His speech would not be one of appeasement. It would be a direct challenge to the international system that had profited from Africa's silence. The moderator introduced Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, and a ripple of unease spread through the chamber. European delegates shifted in their seats, their light conversations silenced into frowns and sharpened stares. Judge Chen looked up from his notes, his pen frozen mid-sentence, studying the young leader with quiet focus. The French delegation leaned together, whispering hurriedly, their discomfort plain even above the low hum of cameras and microphones. As Traoré walked to the podium, television cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing the hardened expression of a man who had crossed thousands of miles to deliver a truth many would rather not hear. The energy in the room shifted from routine diplomacy to charged anticipation. Everyone sensed that the next few minutes would echo far beyond these marble walls. Traoré adjusted the microphone with steady hands. His military bearing was unmistakable. every gesture deliberate as he scanned the chamber of expectant faces. Silence hung for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in diplomatic time. Behind him, his small delegation sat frozen in perfect posture, their expressions betraying nerves beneath the mask of professionalism. In the press gallery, journalists leaned forward, pens ready. They knew this was no ordinary address about development aid or governance. What was about to unfold was something different, a confrontation between Africa's raw demand for sovereignty and the judicial authority of the international order. The young president's eyes swept the chamber with deliberate care, meeting the gaze of key delegates as though measuring their willingness to hear what he was about to say. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of a man with nothing left to lose. "Honorable delegates, distinguished guests," Traoré began, his French accent wrapped around crisp English that surprised those who had expected him to rely on a translator. Judge Chen's attention sharpened at once, noting the choice of language, the calculated tone. Even the moderator glanced at his watch. 15 minutes was all the Burkinabe leader had requested, an unusually short slot for a head of state. European Union representatives exchanged uneasy looks, sensing the measured intensity beneath his words. The acoustics of the chamber carried his voice with crystal clarity, reaching every corner without strain. Translators in their glass booths seemed frozen, as though bracing for the tremor about to ripple through the hall. Traoré paused briefly to arrange his notes, the silence thick with tension. Like charged air before a storm breaks over the savannah, Judge Chen slowly removed his glasses and polished them, a familiar ritual before a complex legal duel. In the press gallery, CNN's correspondent typed furiously, "Traoré about to speak." Energy shifting, something big coming. When Traoré spoke again, his words cut through the silence like a blade through silk. For 60 years, Africa has been told to respect international law, to welcome foreign investment, and to embrace democratic values imposed from outside. The pause that followed was deliberate, allowing translators to catch up, but the English-speaking delegates already felt the challenge embedded in his tone. Judge Chen's pen stilled completely. He knew this was not rhetoric, but a direct step into a legal battlefield. The French delegation stirred, whispers rising in alarm. Every diplomat in the chamber realized this was no polite plea for aid. This was confrontation. "But I ask you today, whose international law protects African children when foreign corporations poison our water with mining chemicals?" His voice rose slightly, controlled yet powerful, his military training evident in the precision of his delivery. Papers rustled as delegates frantically flipped through briefing notes, searching for prepared answers to questions they hadn't expected. The Swiss moderator glanced nervously at the clock, uncertain whether to intervene. Traoré reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded contract, the same one he had studied on the long flight from Ouagadougou. He held it up. "This agreement, signed by my predecessor with the French mining giant Arva, grants them rights to our uranium for 99 years at only 5% of its market value." The words detonated in the chamber like a bomb. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Pens scratched furiously in the press section. The French delegate, Marie Dubois, froze mid-motion as panic flickered across her face. Judge Chen's eyebrows lifted slightly, his mind immediately parsing the legal complexities. An entire doctrine of international contract law was being dragged into question in real time. And then came the declaration that would ricochet across continents. "So today, before this assembly, I declare that Burkina Faso will no longer honor contracts signed without the consent of our people, regardless of what international courts or powerful governments may say." The chamber fell into stunned silence. The words hung heavy, an unexploded charge reverberating in the air. European delegates leaned urgently toward their aides, whispering. American representatives reached for secure phones to alert Washington. In the press gallery, the CNN correspondent typed, "Traoré declares economic independence. Legal earthquake. Backlash inevitable." In just a few sentences, the young African president had thrown down a gauntlet that would force the world to choose between profit and principle. Judge Chen set down his pen, his mind already racing. He knew this confrontation was about to collide with him and that history would remember what came next. The The stage was set for Judge Chen's response, one that would echo long after the session ended. He rose from his seat with deliberate precision, every movement calm and exact, like a surgeon preparing for an operation. The black folds of his robe brushed against the chair as he stepped forward, and the chamber fell into complete silence. Even the Swiss moderator, gavel in hand, froze mid-motion as he watched the American jurist approach the response podium. Delegates leaned forward, sensing that this was no longer routine diplomacy, but a confrontation that could redefine international order. At the opposite podium, Traoré stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his defiance clear. He had already burned every bridge. Now he braced for the fire that was coming. Television cameras swung between the two men, capturing what would soon become one of the most replayed moments in modern diplomacy. Chen adjusted the microphone, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. His expression was calm, but his voice carried the authority of 2 decades on the federal bench. "Captain Traoré," Chen began, the word captain landing with surgical precision. The choice was not accidental. It denied Traoré the title of president, a calculated refusal to recognize his military-backed rule. A murmur rippled through the hall. European delegates exchanged glances of satisfaction. African representatives stiffened, recognizing the deliberate slight. Chen allowed the translators a moment to catch up before delivering the next strike. "Your passion for your people is admirable," he said evenly, "but international law exists precisely to prevent strong men from tearing up contracts when they find them inconvenient to their political narratives." His words sliced through the chamber like steel, calm, sharp, devastating. The French delegation exhaled in quiet relief, watching as Chen dismantled Traoré's moral authority point by point. African delegates shifted uncomfortably, caught between pride for Traoré's defiance and the crushing realization that Chen's arguments carried deadly weight in international law. From the press gallery, CNN's correspondent typed furiously, "Chen dismantling Traoré's position brutal." To watch, Traoré's aides whispered frantically, urging caution, but the young leader raised a hand to silence them. His eyes never left Chen's. He knew he had walked into a storm, but he would not look away. Then Chen paused. Slowly, he removed his glasses, cleaned them with the same composure he had shown 1,000 times before, and fixed his gaze directly on Traoré. When he spoke, it was with the cold authority of a man who understood both law and history. "The road to tyranny, Captain, is always paved with good intentions over the bodies of contracts that inconvenience the powerful." The line hit like a hammer blow. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a verdict. In a single sentence, Chen had reframed Traoré not as a liberator, but as a would-be dictator cloaked in the language of justice. The chamber erupted in whispers, pens scribbling furiously, phones buzzing beneath the desks. European journalists rushed to file breaking updates. African delegates sat in silence, their champion's authority collapsing under the weight of Chen's logic. What armies and sanctions had failed to achieve, Edward Chen had accomplished with words. In 15 seconds, he had stripped Ibrahim Traoré's revolution of its moral armor and left him standing exposed before the world. The Geneva Convention Center trembled with silence. The hum of the air vents filled the void. Delegates sat frozen, pens suspended mid-sentence, as if even writing could not capture the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Cameras zoomed across stunned faces and wide eyes. It was a masterclass in legal warfare, one man's credibility dismantled by the precision of another's intellect. For nearly 15 seconds, no one moved, an eternity in diplomatic time. The chamber remained frozen in silence, the full weight of Judge Chen's devastating response pressing down on everyone present. Ibrahim Traoré stood rigid at the podium, his military posture the only thing keeping him from collapsing under the crushing blow he had just received. His knuckles whitened against the polished wood, the sole outward sign of the internal earthquake shattering the foundation of his revolutionary vision. Behind him, his advisors sat like statues, their carefully rehearsed talking points already worthless against the surgical precision of Chen's words. The young president's eyes stayed locked on the judge, searching desperately for a weakness, some flicker in the jurist's armor that might give him a foothold. But Chen's expression was unreadable, a mask of cold composure forged by decades on the bench. African Union delegates lowered their eyes to their notepads, unable to meet Traoré's gaze. Their silence spoke louder than words. Their champion had been dismantled in less than 60 seconds. The letters from Burkinabe farmers pressed against his chest pocket felt heavier now, their desperate appeals reduced to fragile whispers in the face of an international legal machine built to silence voices like theirs. From the press gallery came the frantic clicking of keyboards. CNN's banner flashed within minutes. American judge destroys African leader with single sentence. BBC correspondent Sarah Mitchell whispered into her microphone, her voice tinged with awe. I've covered diplomacy for 15 years. I've never seen anything this brutal, this precise. The French delegation exchanged discreet glances of triumph, satisfied to see their most persistent critic neutralized without them lifting a hand. On social media, clips of Chen's line went viral almost instantly. The hashtag Chen destroys Traoré acute trended globally. The phrase becoming shorthand for a new kind of diplomatic execution, bloodless but devastating. European newspapers began drafting editorials before the session even ended. Traoré was already being reframed not as a revolutionary voice for justice, but as a reckless strongman brought to heel by the steady hand of constitutional law. Chen's sentence would be cited, dissected, and replayed as definitive proof that his movement had no legitimacy. At the podium, Judge Chen remained motionless. His glasses caught the overhead light, reflecting it like a shield. He showed no satisfaction, no regret, only the professionalism of a jurist who had delivered a verdict. The American delegation sat in silent admiration, recognizing they had just witnessed a masterclass in legal warfare that would be taught in law schools for decades. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system and the soft clicks of camera shutters. Delegates sat frozen, pens suspended mid-sentence, as if recording the moment itself was beyond their reach. It was clear to all, Edward Chen had done what armies, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure could not. He had crushed a revolution with words alone.